I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone. My name is Tony Jenkins. I think everyone knows me. I'm a professor in the program of Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. And it's really my great pleasure today to welcome you to this visiting research talk given by Fernando Garcia Naddaf. So Fernando is a really remarkable human being. I met him about 2 years ago now at an event at Bus Boys and Poets, where he was speaking at the launch of a new publication on nonviolent journalism. And in that space and in our conversations that follow, we really hit it off in terms of seeing the intersections between our work in justice and peace studies and his work as an academic, a diplomat, and a humanist. So his work kind of specializes in the intersections of international relations, political communication, nonviolent journalism, and peace. And he does a lot of work exploring politics within social media and concentrates on promotion of peace in Latin America, particularly examining the role of social movements in fostering peace. So as a visiting scholar for the 2024 academic year with us, his research focused on exploring, in particular, the intersections of the notion of critical comprehensive peace education and the pedagogies and philosophies of the humanism movement in Latin America. And it's been a truly great pleasure to share and learn with Fernando these past 18 months. And I have high hopes that his research that he's conducted during this period is going to offer some important insights for the future direction of the field of peace education. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Fernando.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Yes. Well, of course, I would like to start by thanking Ellen for providing the space where I can share this research with you, and of course, a special thanks to Tony Jenkins, who, besides what how he told us as how we met, he also introduced me to a lot of new topics, especially those related with comprehensive peace education, as he has been an excellent sparring partner over these past months, always offering good ideas and showing generosity, and above all is friendship. So thank you, Tony, very much on this. Yes, well, the name of my research that I want to share with you, it's Decolonizing Peace Education, Lessons from a Humanist Perspective in South America. The main focus of my research was to address contemporary critics of critical peace education and to contribute in some way to a more decolonized approach, but from within a certain epistemology. As Tony mentioned, I'm a humanist. I've been identifying as a humanist almost for 20 years. I think I have been a humanist all my life, but it was 20 years ago that I recognized myself as such. And it's been, let me tell you very briefly, that it's been like going against the stream, you know, like we live in a postmodern world that usually we don't try to identify ourselves with any kind of collective group in general. You know, we're so individualism is so hardly promoted in these days that it's hard, you know, to identify oneself in such a epistemologic or perspective, you know. So it has been in quite a challenge to show. And of course, during these 20 years, as I will tell you, humanists and humanism, are not concepts really easy to explain, to understand. You know, even for me, you know, like 2 decades ago was not easy. That's why I want to share with you, to begin sharing with you, what at least very briefly before getting into the main points, what we understand by humanism and by humanist. because, when I arrived here, of course, the first cultural shock was perhaps was this, that because the humanism, the concept of humanism that I found here was a little bit displaced of what humanism was understood in South America or even in some countries in Europe, not in all countries, but as I will explain, there are different nuances. As you know very well, the term has come, it has many centuries, from the beginning of the 14th century with Petrarch and Dante and those kind of names, but it has a long tradition till nowadays, till these days, and going very hardly through the 20th century. In the humanism that I found here in Washington, D.C., and in other places of America, and in the United Kingdom in particular, it's kind of a struggle against some kind of visions within society that should not be submitted to religious thought or to churches. So it's a struggle towards laicism, or to a secularization of society. Humanism, of course, for a lot of people, is not, even though could mean that it could also mean in that sense. The focus of the center of humanism, of course, was not the sense that perhaps was that we can find in this long tradition from the beginning of the 14th century till nowadays. There are a lot of people that have recognized themselves, which belong or are part of some kind of religious thought. Just to mention some, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Lev Tolstoy. They're all humanists. And they belong to some. So that's the first thing to clarify. It's not a matter of religion, but rather to humanists put at the center of its social action, in the center of the thought, the human being, the concrete human being. And this is very important because during the large part of the 20th century, and even now, we see a lot of movements and ideologies or epistemologies that do not recognize the human being as the center as a central criteria to act in the public sphere or in a collective way. Sometimes we tend to superimpose or to put in a more dominant position ideas such as the nation state or a religion or the market, and these ideas sometimes, get imposed in the public sector, or in politics. And sometimes we postpone the concrete human being, sometimes for the idea of a future human being or for the abstract idea, structuralism, Marxism. Sometimes, are a little bit displaced, even though we can find Marxist humanists, Marxists that are humanists. But, the center of, if you put the center of your action in the future of some mankind, you're not centering the criteria in the contingent and concrete human being nowadays who is really suffering. That's a very important point of view or a point of departure, because if we acknowledge that point of view, there's a lot of other consequences. For instance, if you want to center the point of view in humankind, you will begin to have different criteria on how you move in everyday life. You begin to see the other as an equal. You begin to think in justice, concrete justice. You begin to think the importance of peace, of nonviolence, because you have to acknowledge the other as an equal, not affected by some kind of frame of religion or politics or ideology that makes a distance among each other. And of course, as we humanists believe that it's peace and nonviolence, the way in how to approach or to relate the other towards justice, we cannot admit violence, as a way or a means to get the other. So nonviolence and peace is very important. And of course, education. Education is the way how to get the other, how to promote this idea. There's no other means, it shouldn't be like through force. So that's a more general idea. Of course, as I was telling you, humanism and humanists have come from a long time. But the particular branch of humanists, there are many, has been developing in South America during the last 50 years, or so, even 55 years, and in the border of Chile and Argentina. And this has been a very, I don't know, successful experience. It was born around 1970, 1969, when many humanists gathered around the leadership of some writers and inspiring persons, such as the ones I mentioned, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. At that time, we were like looking forward how to progress or to overcome the associations, the crisis of that time through non-violence, through peace. And particularly one writer, which is Argentina, which is Mario Rodriguez Cobos, who began to lead many humanists in Chile and Argentina, and began to promote this way of thinking all around the world today. So we can find, of course, many humanists in South America, but also in Europe, even in North America, in Africa, and in Asia. But of course, we have a much more concentration. Those points that I put it in the map are centers. That doesn't mean that we don't have humanists in Russia. There's actually very interesting experiences in Russia during the perestroika with humanists. But those points means that in those places are centers of studies and gatherings, trying to understand the relation of human being with others, and particularly one thing that's very important for humanists is how conscience, and that's a very important thing that we will see soon. Because conscience, it's very important. It's a very important trait of humankind, and it's a way in how we communicate. We are communicating now through conscience. We need conscience to be in this kind of relationship, even though we are mediatized through Zoom, but we are engaging each other through conscience. So if we are gathering, if we are making this connection through conscience, it's important to understand what conscience is. As I was telling you, I've been part of the humanist movement for nearly 2 decades, and of course, this affiliation has helped me, to have a direct contact with its epistemology and praxis, and has allowed me to recognize. Oh, wait a minute, because. Yeah, to recognize the elements of humanism embedded with the peace education studies. Let me tell you that when I first began talking these subjects and topics with Tony, I began doing seeing the literature and papers on peace, critical peace education and comprehensive. I noticed very instantly that there were many traits that humanists have been developing during 5 decades already in workshops, in schools, in universities, topics that critical peace education and comprehensive peace education in particular were sharing point of views and perspectives, and of course, I thought that immediately that it could be a way to share, to observe these accumulated experience of the humanist movement or the humanist perspective, to do a double click on it, in a way on how to understand what was happening within the topic of critical peace education and comprehensive peace education. Just to settle things again more clearly, the key goal today of humanists is to promote a culture of peace and nonviolence as a means to address what a very important point, a profound civilizational crisis. And I would like to underline this civilizational crisis because for humanists, there has been a long way already of this civilizational crisis. Today, we have more conscience on it. But 3 decades ago, it was not the case. No, decades ago, they were rising. A lot of civilizational crises all in all countries. Like people who were more sensitive to this. Not only the climate change that we're more aware of today, but also the nuclear crisis. Or the digital disruption today, the nuclear crisis. Of course, yes. After the end of the Cold War, we thought that the whole world was kind of entering a kind of a end of history, as some were promoting, and 1,000 years of peace. But of course, no, very few were thinking or worrying about these nuclear weapons that were distributed all around the world, that were going to be there for 200, 300, or 500 years. Things change very rapidly. From 5 or 10 years, or even as we're witnessing today, in very few months, things change very abruptly. So the nuclear weapons were a major hazard to civilization, and it is still today, and it's going to be until we don't address it. And today, of course, we have the climate change and the digital disruption. So a lot of crises are all around, and the only ones who are being addressed to solve the situations are human beings on themselves. It's their organization, it's their taking conscience and their mobilization by whatever means. But it's only human beings that are the ones in charge to solve the situation. And we have to understand that, which is a cornerstone of this thought. So for this reason, the humanists in South America were engaged, and all around the world actually, in many areas. Now, from grassroots activism to institutional politics. Let me tell you, when I knew this before the interviews that I had for this research, but for instance, the engagement in institutional politics at a certain moment was seen as a way on how to occupy the state power, but actually it was a way on how to educate, and still, they think it like that, like it's to use politics to gain a showcase, for making more conscience, on this crisis, on how to conduct, on how to save humanity, or how to project it. From media advocacy to education, schools, universities, and communities. In all these areas, education is a cornerstone. It's the only way or tool to do it. So, acting in all these areas through education has been this accumulated experience that I thought it was a good experience. It was idea to share it with you. Here you can find some images, to have just. That the images, have a more graphic representation. You can see, like those are the picture in the upper right side. You have the teachers in workshops, learning about nonviolence. In the down part, you have at universities, you have this activism that I'm in the upper left side, and in the down part you can do these two persons. One of these is Mario Aguilar, which he wrote books and on pedagogy, and he's a teacher, and he's the president of the teacher union national level, and he's humanist for, I don't know, 30-40 years. So which humanists are trying to engage this education, peace education, non-violence education, through all these means. Okay, why humanism and critical peace education? Because I believe that humanist peace education initiatives, whether it's through workshops or at schools, formal and informal education, may fall under academic frameworks of peace education studies, such as critical peace education or comprehensive peace education, as I mentioned before. And also because I think that humanists could represent an experience, a valuable experience from the global south, which is one of the critics I identified before during the research, and that address weaknesses identified in the critical peace education, as I said, sorry. And examining in South American humanism may help to enrich critical and empirical perspective on peace education. Well, one of the first things I did was trying to identify, like looking at the literature of the last 10 or 15 years on critical peace education. Particularly, there were many papers that were rising up, like a lot of critics towards critical peace education studies. So, of course, there were many, but I summed here 4, and I added a 5th one that I wanted to also add. That's the last one. The first one, it was very common within the critics of peace education nowadays, again, in 10 or 15 years of literature, there was a lack of integration of psychological, social, and cultural dimensions into peace education programs. There was a lack, sometimes it popped up the idea there was lack of holism in holism in peace education studies. And so sometimes it was so very centered in social or in culture, but sometimes it lacked psychological, and so on. Also, that peace education initiatives miss to empower individuals for collective and institutional transformation. So there's a lot of experience, like given a lot of efforts and experiences towards peace education initiatives, but these didn't lead on for transforming collectives or institutional frameworks. Also, third, not enough incorporation of, as I already mentioned, non-Western epistemologies and global South perspective. That was, up and down, and a lot of people say we are going, but we are working on that. The Journal of Peace Education that I discussed with, they say we are incorporating some perspective, but it appeared very often that there was a lack of perspective on that. And fourth, the imbalance between addressing structural violence and fostering individual responsibility, which has some kind of relation with the second critic, but it has a little difference that I will show you, try to explain it further. And finally, I thought it was a good idea to add a 5th critic, which is the role of informal education compared to formal education. Sometimes it's a great emphasis towards formal educations in the papers or in the literature of critical peace education. But of course, there's a lot of instances where we do and create education which are not formal. We do a lot of cross-passing and sharing information regarding what is peace, how to change the word towards peace or nonviolence, but those spaces are not enough considered sometimes in the literature. So my research focus was trying to observe peace education practices within the South American humanist movement in particular. Yeah. Okay, so which were the key questions? Grabbing the critics that I just mentioned, I identified 5 questions I wanted to look for. First one, does American humanism incorporate psychological, social, and cultural dimension in its peace efforts? And if it's so, how? Does humanism value individual empowerment as a pathway to broader social change? If so, how? What recognition does human peace education give to non-Western epistemologies and global South perspectives? Fourth, how does humanism address structural violence in its understanding of violence? Fifth, what role does informal education play compared to formal education in humanist peace initiatives? With these 5 questions, I wanted to, put a step forward, push a little bit the boundaries, to understand, at least, to explore how the experience of these 5 decades of experience could address the critics of this education. How the research was conducted? Well, I did interviews that were conducted with leaders of the humanist movement. I didn't care, at least in this moment, with the audiences, with the students, I guess. I mean, but furthermore, it was more important in this moment to see what was in their minds and the intentions of the ones who were leading these initiatives. Those who were involved, doing workshops for citizens, journalists, activists, or students. Of course, I review books, reports, and documents published by the Humanist Movement and its leaders. And I tried to focus on techniques, pedagogy, and peace education theories. Okay, just to have you like an idea who were these key interviews. I got the director of Humanist Studies Centers, they developed for a long time peace education programs in schools, the director of International Press Agency, Presenza, who made the major core, the major subject is non-violent journalism workshops. We have had an experienced professor who has a long experience with non-formal and formal education, a former vice minister for culture in Peru, organizer of a march, World March. It's very important. It's a World March for Peace and Nonviolence, who did a lot of volunteer workshops and some other long-time humanistic. Okay, which are the findings? Okay, if the first critic I identified was that this lack of holism, like this psychological, social, and cultural dimensions integrated in education efforts, well, the first thing I noticed was that humanists do integrate this dimension. I will try to deepen this idea, but one particular point is this one. They integrate experiences in almost all their educational experiences. They integrate experiences very close, keen to meditation. Psychophysical, or the translation could be distinction activities. This is very important because the underlying belief to do this kind of workshops, is that the violence stems from internal or mental suffering. That's like very close to Buddhism or other schools of thought, So resolving this internal violence is a prerequisite for addressing broader societal and cultural issues. So we have this emergence of two sides of the story. You cannot, this is very, by the interviews, it was very often stated, you cannot change a violent word if you keep, or you have, if you have violence internally, So you can change the word, you can move forward, but first you have to do an internal work, so how we do it, And of course, we have to take tools from other disciplines or other words, because unfortunately, in Western society, in Western education, we don't take much attention on that. We're always worried so much in the outside word, the external word. But if you want to change the word, you have to change the word. You cannot change a violent word if you are, and becoming non-violent or peaceful if you're still violent. And this, of course, for those who are interested, this take a long approach, a very hard approach, and a distance approach, epistemological approach from perspectives such as Marxism, for instance. If you want to change the word, you have to, or realist in international politics, to take both sides. So these practices aim to address the psychological roots of suffering and violence. Fostering internal disposition conducive to peace education. Okay, what's up? If you are, they believe that, we believe that in some way we have these internal contradictions. The internal contradiction makes, this suffering, which in some way makes that our response to the world could be violent. you know. And well, you know, a lot of people, you know, again, they think it's desires, but what are our desires? You have to double click in your desires. Today we are in a society hyper stimulated through of desires. So how are if we are continuing having more and more desires, more our attention towards our desires, and we're not dealing with it, of course we are going to have a lot of violence. You know, perhaps what's happening today in the world, it's a reflection of that. And this, of course, means that we have an holistic approach, you know, a progression from psychological healing to social cultural transformation. And this goes the interconnectedness central to humanist methodology. So we have this very easily, it popped out very easily, the situation. I wanted to share, it was a suggestion of a friend. He told me, yeah, you have to show this image, you know, because this image, for instance, is very common in the workshops, you know, because, for instance, let me share this. I guess this could be interesting for us all. You know, for instance, in school, in traditional school, they teach us always, you know, that how many senses do we have? They teach us that we have 5 senses. I have a call with we have 5 senses, you know, sight, you know, hearing, and so on. But if I ask you, where did you feel with those 5 senses? Where do you feel when you are angry? With those 5 senses, where do you feel love? Where do you feel that you have hunger? You know, those are internal sense. You know, you feel it in some way in a part inside your body. You know, so you can, if you can recognize when you're angry, when you're anguish, you know, makes a lot of difference. You know, these things very detailed, you know, very basic, you know, are not shared, are not experiences, are not taught in our schools. You know, how much difference we could make if we can identify, you know, when we are angry, why we're angry. You know, okay, I'm angry now. Okay, why I'm angry? Why do I feel that this person, my colleague, I don't know, it's an enemy for me because it's another religion, it's from another country. Why I'm feeling that? You know, we have to gain for that. You know, so this is a way how they you know how to identify, you know, these feelings inside, to identify, you know, these internal senses, which are very recognized by the way by Western science. You know, we call it synesthetic or kinesthetic. You know, synesthetic means like inside, and kinesthetic is a way on how you feel the word in physical terms. You know, but you know, I don't know why we don't address this kind of perspectives. I don't know now why I cannot change. Okay. Second point of critic, value. Am I over exceeding the time? I don't know. I will try to do it. Yes?
I think we're okay on time. I just want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for
I
Q&A.
will
So
try
maybe
to do it
another
very,
10
very
minutes
fast.
or so. I'll be okay. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The value of individual empowerment as a pathway to broader social change. That was the second critic. Of course, there was a lot of focus on individual empowerment. Humanism emphasizes the individual empowerment as a foundation for collective action to address the current civilization crisis. I have already explained that, so I will not go on deeper on that. There's a personal transformation that's needed. The change begins within the individual, who must engage in introspection, as I said, and meditation to address roots of internal violence and suffering. That's the first point. Then it comes the ethical foundations, guided such as principles like treat, you know, the golden rule, let's say, you know, treat others as you would like to be treated. That's ethical. You know, personal transformation forces ethicals for the connections with others. And this is the other part, collective impact. Internal change equips individuals to become agents of social and civilization transformation, linking personal growth to global renewal. And this is it's graphic in this image. You know, perhaps most of you know this Moebius strip. You know, this is very iconic within the humanist perspective, because the Moebius strip proves or want to show that the external part of the strip is the same as the internal. You cannot change the word if you know. There's a close relation between the internal and the external. It's the same thing. You know, that's why humanists always use this kind of graphics and the logos and stuff. Third point is structural violence. Okay, we all understand that structural violence in, I don't know, Paulo Freire, even before, this acknowledgement of structural violence, the recognition of multiple forms of violence. Humanism, of course, acknowledges violence. This is also a cornerstone. It's not only physical, it includes economic, racial, and religious violence. This has been stated since 50 years ago. There's a moral stance on this. Any act causing pain or suffering to others is immoral, highlighting the immorality of all forms of violence. That is stated literally. Humanism, in this way, recognizes violence as a structural issue embedded within social, economic, and cultural systems. That's very easy, and as a consequence of what I've mentioned before. So there's a commitment to eradicating all forms of violence. Individuals must aim to overcome both personal and systemic violence to address the root causes of suffering and conflict. And of course, this leads to a political engagement with the humanist approach, emphasizes political commitment to social transformation as essential. This is an example again. There's a lot of activism, or actions within the streets. Down these iconic figures are Gandhi, Luther King, Martin Luther King, CELO, which is the mentioned before, Lev Tolstoy again, and they do a lot of like education. And of course, there's a non-Western epistemology emphasis, even though humanists recognize themselves as heritaries of a political reflection that comes. It's Western. This comes from phenomenology, which is perhaps some of you know from Edmund Brentano and Husserl. Those were Austrian authors from the beginning of the 20th century, and who inspired the whole school of thought. And of course, their focus is trying to understand again what I've mentioned very briefly before: conscience. How do we approach conscience with the scientific method? What is conscience? If we understand what conscience is, what is me? What is the person? If we understand what is the person, what is conscience? Well, we can act, we can solve stuff. If we don't solve this thing as soon as possible, we can get again the crisis. That it's all very linked. So even though they're inherited this epistemologic perspective for philosophy from Europeans, there's a constant and permanent renovation of authors, which of course comes and recognize other cultures. There was very common also to recognize indigenous techniques. Well, as I mentioned before, also other conclusions. Okay, of course, I found some that humanism integrates psychological, social, and cultural dimensions into peace education efforts, emphasizing a comprehensive understanding of violence and conflict resolution. Of course, this was intuitively thought in the first moment when I first noticed, but for me, it's very clear and evident that there was this holistic approach. And of course, again, the individual empowerment. It's all the educational efforts in all of the workshops. It's shown that this link between the individual level and the broader social and civilization level also change. Structural understanding, absolutely. Violence is not understood only in physical terms. It's economic, racial, religion, and the recognition of non-Western epistemology. And all around the research, of course, there was this highlighting of non-formal education, which was, even, trying to act as a political actor, to use that scenario for educational means. Of course, as a proof of the importance of informal. Of course, there's a lot of other things to do. I would like to continue this. Further research is required to analyze specific experiences, and to show the impact If what has been identified is correct, of course, we need to look for more specific examples and to further to observe the community impact. We need to have measurable impact indicators, and yes, critical evaluation of these outcomes is necessary to assess their effectiveness. Detailed documentation can improve methods and broaden the scope of similar initiatives in other parallel works, not only in South America, and potential to extend peace education projects beyond the humanist framework in South America. That's it. I'm sorry that I just ran up, but I guess I really I surpassed some moments, of time. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, the rest.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Let's take a moment to open it up for questions for Fernando, questions of clarification, questions to probe more deeply, to inquire more deeply into this relationship between humanism and peace education, or just kind of reflections and comments anyone wants to bring.
I'll start first.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Fernando, and thanks, Tony, for introducing Fernando and the time that you have both conducted research in the past year. Very interesting, very informative. My question is, if humanist perspective is on this side of the framework, what's the complete opposite to it? What's on the other side of the spectrum? And what's the all the way on the other side of it? And when you mentioned in the last slide the impact, which examples represent this humanist epistemology? And I know you said that's future research, but just and which one of them represents this opposite spectrum? In what do you think?
Yes, in humanist terms, we always talk about anti-humanism, no? Because there's a long historic struggle among both, but sometimes we tend to think anti-humanism being expressed in ideological terms, as, I don't know, with Hitler and Nazism, or communism. But actually, anti-humanism, you can find it in neoliberalism. Why? Because sometimes you say, okay, neoliberalist thought tend to think that, okay, if you make a lot of structural changes to economy and to education, whatever, on privatizing everything, it will be not good for the current generation, but for 2 generations in the future, and that's of course it's obliterating or not recognizing the importance of the concrete human being, which is being affected with the reforms, and if you concentrate the image towards the concrete human being now, well, it all aligns in some way. Of course, you cannot postpone, you cannot hazard, you cannot put in risk the current generation for some image that you may have that could be good, whatsoever it could be. It could be. That's why neoliberalism centering the idea that market will solve everything. Or that the state will save it. Those are very anti-humanistic perspectives. Or today, what we've seen, there are a lot of people thinking that living in Mars, other kind of species will save the humanity. For what reason? We don't even know if we could live in Mars, but a lot of people are suffering because of that idea. That's totally the transhumanism and posthumanism is. Especially transhumanism, it's very dangerous, and it's anti-humanistic at all. The second question, I don't know if, like, you want to explain you some specific experiences? Yeah, of course. For instance, I have many, but let me very briefly too. For instance, the Center of Humanist Studies, they engage in workshops in popular neighborhoods in Chile. So they managed to do this, and it was sponsored by the Minister of Education. They applied for funding, and they did long-term studies. And there were experiences that were very affected by violence, bullying, and social and drugs and stuff like that. And they intervened the situation. You know, they went in depth and they did these workshops, and they measured, you know, before and after. And the experience was pretty well. It was very well evaluated, and the numbers they showed was that the experiences were down. You know, I would like to, if someone could go deeper in these numbers. Of course, we would like to contrast those numbers, but at least what they said was that the violence, in terms of violence, they went down very dramatically.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just briefly. Another experience. They went also to Africa because, you know, they tried to do this all around. And they went to Africa and while helping people in very, very poor villages to how to put how do you say the water into boil water to drink water. Just a very simple. They did also these workshops to try to manage with different cans or different, you know, to avoid violence. That was another very good experience where they melt, you know, they merge social, internal, and collective transformation.
Thank you.
You can hear me, right? I'm just checking
Yes,
my computer audio is a little low today. Fernando, thank you so much, really, for this presentation. As an anthropologist who is also teaching nonviolence, I don't want to say who comes from South Asia, but maybe that's also the third thing to add. I learned so much, and I'm sure I only represent the audience here to echo with you that the humanist movement will probably do well to incorporate, you know, more perspectives from global South in general, the epistemology mentioned, and I was thinking about Rabindranath Tagore as, you know, writer poet from 20th century, early 20th century, but also Arundhati Rai and more recent authors and voices from South Asia in general, and there I had a question to ask you, because when you started this presentation by talking about how you found the movement here in North America and sort of found the political religious influences not really helping a lot, but rather a problem, or that's a struggle maybe you had when you wanted to place South American history and position regarding this matter here in North America. And I'm just asking myself, and again, this comes definitely from South Asian and other perspectives, so again, from Global South, how much faith has a play in it? How much sort of, I mean, maybe one way to put my question is like this, like if there can be a Marxist humanist, even if on the margin, can there be a faithist humanist? Does faith have something or even a lot to bring into the question that you're asking, again, to describe the humanist movement? Like, does South American humanism incorporate, you know, psychological, social, cultural dimensions in its peace education? I'm just asking myself, where does it draw its sort of power, you know, from, right? Can faith have something helpful to do in this question? So I guess that's this. I'll just stop here and maybe from you your thoughts about this part. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Helen. Absolutely, yes, you're absolutely right. You can find humanists that are Catholics, Muslims. You know, it's very common actually. You know, that's why I mentioned in the first moment, that of course we humanists acknowledge the Christians humanists like Martin Luther King Jr. You know, or which pastor, you know, and Muhammad Gandhi's. Tagore, of course, you know, I showed you in the first place like this map, well, and in those places they're always studying humanist experiences, no matter if they're religious or not, and it's totally, you know, there's another cornerstone on this, that nobody chooses the house, the family, or the country, or the society. Nobody. So you cannot blame you for, on your thoughts, whatever. That's a cornerstone of this. That is the basis for understanding. And I want to mention also that very important. You triggered me on thought that there's a very special emphasis between peace and nonviolence. Humanists tend more to think on nonviolence terms rather than in peace. Why? Because peace, it sometimes gets isolated, in individual terms, so it somehow makes a big, sometimes make a border, for acting collectively. The way to act collectively is nonviolence. Peace sometimes, it's you have to like pacifism. It's like sometimes it's understood in very passive terms. Like you're not against it. No, I'm not against it. But for a humanist term, you have to be engaged. It's necessary. It's ethical. It's a historical responsibility. It's an historical responsibility. Perhaps that's why I was also triggered to join to be part of this program. Because it's part of my duty. Is also to promote this kind of education. It's ethical. It's part of my existential situation. I have to acknowledge that. So that's why humanists tend to be more friendly towards nonviolence rather than peace, and that's the mixture from political empowerment that sometimes is critical as critical peace education. Thank you, Helen, for your questions.
Thank you.
Fernando, I have a lot of questions, but I'll pick one. Let me lean towards, I guess, your last comment here. So you talk about humanism being, a historical vocation, like a historical project, developing that deep sense of human agency. So the question I have is kind of a pedagogical one. Like you put forward a beautiful theory of change that sees, the personal, leading towards the political. And I think that's really important. But how is it what does the pedagogy look like in terms of, how it moves from, the human beings as conscious to, Ferian consciousness to human agency? What are the learning mechanisms and theories and processes for how we instill that sense of human agency to take action on those internal convictions externally?
You mean like which kind of tools like you have inside the classroom?
Yeah, yes, as you think about obviously humanism, obviously what's happening in formal spaces, a lot of it is, as you noted, taking place in non-formal settings. What does the learning look like? Like how do you explore, making that connection, the internal to the external,
Yes.
right?
Tony, thank you for the question actually, because when I was exposed to Paulo Freire readings, it's actually very similar to that. You have you try always to be very conscious of the situation of power that the teacher has within a classroom. So you try. There are no lectures in a formal or traditional sense. There's no one like. It's always like, okay, we give some orientations, some ideas, and then you pass, the stick to the group. The group then they decide, and they take decisions, and then afterwards, in small groups, this is very typical. In small groups, they debate, they assume, they create new reasons. The new groundings, and after that experience, they share, they exchange. That's very, very typical, very common. They exchange and they integrate a collective knowledge of the problem that was trying to be solved, or their perspective, and this could be analyzed or applied to any kind of situation. You give again, like orientations, questions, some kind of perspectives, then dividing the group in many groups, the groups are taking decisions, and the decisions inform sometimes the teacher, who may take a new perspective, and that's why, again, how you go from the personal to group and to the collective way. Yes, absolutely. That's very common. And also, I noticed, and I can experience also, that many times the workshops begins with this kind of situations like meditations, because it puts you in a situation. It's like sometimes you are, in a hurry, you're thinking so many things, you're coming from school from the work, and you have to calm down, because you need to be like concentrated, you need to be like focused, you have to be into, be one conscience, so that also means, and in third terms, again, it's not like traditional, you have to have spaces. That's very important, like in the morphology, for morphology of the places to study, you don't need a class, that's the minimum. Perhaps you need many classes or a garden, or an auditorium, and many places because it's needed, so that's, I don't know if that helps you, because of course I totally agree, it differs a little bit, or perhaps a lot, like traditional education.
No, I think that's really helpful. What I'm obviously trying to do is see how it intersects with different peace education, pedagogical frameworks, and make those connections even deeper. So, if you have these kind of three stages, the personal, the ethical, to the collective, the pedagogical processes at the personal involve, it sounds like, a number of different things, incorporating forms of reflection, transrational experiences, so the embodied learning, the internalized learning, going beyond just the rational, to then moving from there into the kind of rational discourse that brings in the ethical perspectives and the structural analysis, and then from there to the social learning, and then from there to the collective action. So that to me, that's the embodiment of the praxis. That sounds really, really beautiful. And the transrationalism at the heart of it, I think, is what distinguishes the humanist approach from many other approaches that we talk about.
That's a term I didn't use, but yes, of course, you're totally right. Yeah, I do agree.
Well, I know we are right here at the end of our time. Are there any last questions that anyone has? Then I would like to go ahead and just, again, express our sincere gratitude for Fernando's talk today, but also for his sharing of experiences and all the wonderful knowledge and energy that he's brought to the JEPS community this past year. My students have benefited. Thank you again for speaking in some of my courses and making yourself available to students who want to explore these questions with you. And so it's been a joyful journey, and I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations into the future.
That's for sure. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ella. Thank you. I'm grateful. Thank you, Ella, for your question. Thank you.